The financial industry is undergoing rapid transformation. Digitalization, machine learning and blockchain are impacting traditional financial services and products, while concerns about climate change are directing financial resources into sustainable investments. ESA is using its space activities to help the industry adapt. How can space boost innovation in the finance industry? Merging asset data with Earth observation data provides insights at scales relevant to many different financial applications, ranging from project finance to nature-based solutions. As society begins to recover from the COVID pandemic, receiving data in real time enables rapid analysis and supports risk modelling and assessment, keeping Europe at the cutting edge of financial innovation. How can your organisation use space to improve life on Earth through an innovative, green and digital finance industry? ESA's Downstream Gateway provides easy access to the agency's expertise, technology and data. The initiative helps people to turn space-based ideas into commercial reality. Realise the huge potential of space with the ESA Downstream Gateway. Innovators welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First of all, apologize for the technical problem we had. We started with a few minutes of delay, but without any further delay, I introduce myself. I'm Donatella Ponziani, ESA Downstream Gateway Officer, and I have the great pleasure to welcome to the Space for Finance workshop our ESA Director General, Joseph Aschbacher, our distinguished speakers, and the more than 700 attendees who have registered to this event from all over the world. We are very much looking forward to listen from you and to answer to all your questions that can be posed on the Q&A session of the WebEx we are following. We have an intense morning in front of us, 3 panels to discuss together from an institutional, industrial and ESA point of view, the challenges associated with the transformation of the financial sectors towards green and digital solution, and of course, how space can support. But before starting the day, in a few minutes, I will leave the floor to our Director General, Joseph Aschbacher, who will set the scene in telling us how ESA is strongly committed towards its Agenda 2025 to stimulate a more vibrant commercial space ecosystem to realize green and digital transformation to the benefit of European society and economy. Without any further delay, I hand over to Joseph. Joseph, thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Donatella, for this introduction, and welcome everyone from my side. I see a very large list of attendees. I was just scrolling through, and I'm very happy to see some quite familiar names, and really special welcome to all of you. So thank you for allowing me to say a few words at the beginning. Commercialization and downstream gateway for me is a top priority of ESA. Donatella was mentioning the Agenda 2025. This is for those who have not yet seen it or not yet read it. Agenda 2025 is the document which we, and I really say we, not myself, but we as ESA have prepared recently to outline the priorities of where we believe ESA has to go in the next couple of years in order to bring space forward and upward, as I call it, and make sure that Europe is maintaining or is establishing a leading role in space. Let me step back for a moment to put this in context. The global economy, space economy, today is estimated at around $350 billion according to Morgan Stanley. The same Morgan Stanley is predicting that the space economy will be worth about $1 trillion by 2040. So this is a huge increase. And the majority of this increase happens in the downstream sector. Of course, the downstream sector will then pull also the need for satellites and launchers in the upstream sector, which is going hand in hand with this evolution. So space is a huge and highly growing and highly dynamic domain. And and this is really what I would like to achieve with Agenda 2025, we have to participate in this. Not only participate, we have to lead some segments of space in order to establish Europe's position in space. And if I say establish, not only for the sake of establishing ourselves, because space has such a high potential in many aspects. One is certainly the economic aspect, and this is the one you're looking at through the downstream sector, but also space, as you all know, is strategic. Space has another function, which is to really serve people and citizens through information which is provided daily, either through navigation systems, telecommunication systems, Earth observation systems, which are providing essential information for everyday life, from weather forecast to car navigation to phone calls or video transmissions between continents. Space is everywhere, and space is integrated in many domains of our daily life. And this is important because here comes the downstream sector to explore where space can be used potentially, and also making sure that new users, new communities are getting on board. The Downstream Gateway, which Donatella is leading, is very important for ESA because it's the gateway, as the name says, into many of the downstream applications which we have across different directorates in ESA. And therefore, this function and this activity of Donatella's group is quite essential to make this happen. So what do I expect in the near future on our side based on the Agenda 2025? As it is written in a document, I'm looking at three elements where I would like to focus to ensure commercialization for a greener and digital Europe. Number one is talent. We need talented people with bright ideas who are ready to realize these ideas and convert their idea into action. That means a product, a service which they are going to develop. Secondly, we need access to funding, capital. This is something where, of course, Silicon Valley is very famous for through the access to venture capital funding. About more than 60% of the global venture capital funding is sitting in Silicon Valley along one long street. Here, Europe has to catch up, and Europe has to make sure that we also tap into these funding sources. There is funding in Europe available in different channels, different organizations, not only banks and venture capital companies, but also outside. And we have to explore those. They have to know space, they have to trust space, and therefore become a potential funder of these organizations. On the other side, if we find talented people with a brilliant idea, we would like them to find access to these funding entities so that their idea is not dying out halfway. We call it the valley of death. When they come up with a brilliant idea, they develop a small prototype, but then they cannot find the funding to make a serial production or a larger project out of it. And here, the connection between talent on one side and funding entities on the other side is important. And we as ESA, we should help achieving that through agreements, frameworks with the funding entities to make sure that this conversion is working. And the third element in this aspect is speed. Speed meaning fast decisions, dynamic responses to very fast developing new space world, which is out there. And here I really would like to ensure that ESA as an organization becomes much faster, much more responsive in interacting with this so-called new space world, which is very fast. And ESA has to be a relevant partner to this community, and therefore we have to adapt. That means we have to be faster between idea and contract, or to convert some of these ideas into action, that means into products. We have several points identified in the Agenda 2025, how we can do that. For example, ESA will also work more in the future as an anchor tenant, anchor customer. That means we are the first buyer of a product which is developed through such companies and entities. We are technical partner and advisor in the venture capital community to tell them what are potential hopeful products that can be funded, because venture capital people are usually bankers and they need advice from a technical point of view, and we can provide this neutral, unbiased advice because we are a European organization. I would also like to support simplified access to ESA programs and facilities to allow people, if they want to use our test facilities, for example, to test a constellation of a small satellite, that they get access to this. As I mentioned already, faster average time to contract, especially for smaller contracts. There we need to really speed up on our side to be relevant for this community. I also would like to expand the network of fee labs. The fee labs, for those of you familiar, is an entity today hosted in the Earth Observation Directorate, but something that I would like to see happening across ESA to support and develop disruptive innovation for all disciplines in space and also in the member states. And I'm right now working on the mechanism how this can be done. I'm happy to see also the head of the Fee Lab, Giuseppe Borghi, with us, and understand he will later today speak to you to explain how the Fee Lab is working. But this is something which also I would like to develop as part of this commercialization activity, especially in the downstream segment. Then, of course, we also would like to make use of prizes and grants, which we have in our portfolio of how we can work with companies. It is there, it is used, but not a lot, and this is something we certainly want to increase, to award, to have competitions for the best ideas, where we at the end of the day give an award or a prize to a company who has the winning idea or in a certain segment. So as you see, there's a lot to do. We have a long list of actions that comes out of Agenda 2025. It is not yet published, but I will publish it to my member states in the next couple of weeks. But there is a lot of long list of actions which I would like to go through in order to make sure that we are relevant for the downstream sector, that we are relevant for the new space community, of course, at the same time for the what I would call the more traditional space community, but here we are speaking to the new space community, and this for me is a priority, and I really would like to put a lot of emphasis that we can work well together and that ESA is a trusted partner for whatever idea you have and you want to materialize. Thank you, and I hand back to Donatella.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for your words, for encouraging our work, and we will take the action from you, and without any further delay, we will start the discussion with our already established and new potential partners. And so thank you again for being with us today, Joseph.
Thank you.
I think that we can start with the very first panel of the day. As I said, we have 3 panels in front of us. The very first one is dedicated to policy and regulation perspective. So we will tackle the transformation of financial sector from this point of view. Together with me, we have Sasha Deutsch and Thomas Krohn, who are both in my team, and they are business analysis, and they are very much into this sector, and they will support the animation of the question and answer section. We have also the pleasure to have a very distinguished speaker, Olivier Mahoul, practice manager at the World Bank in the Crisis and Disaster Risk Finance Unit, Paul Albert, head of Systemic Risk and Financial Institution Division at the European Central Bank, Claire Joly, head of unit at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Marianne Haar, director of Green Digital Finance Alliance, and David Carlin, task force on climate-related financial disclosures from the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative. I would like to introduce now our first speaker to the panel, who is Dr. Olivier Mahoul. Olivier is an economist a global expert in decision theory under uncertainty, with application in development economics, climate finance, and disaster risk finance and insurance. Olivier currently leads the Crisis and Disaster Risk Finance Unit and its Disaster Risk Financing and Insurance Program at the World Bank, which offers analytical and advisory services for policy reforms and financial instruments against climate shocks, disaster, and a wider range of crises in more than 60 emerging and developing countries all over the globe. Olivier holds a PhD in economics from the Toulouse Business School and postdoctorate experience from Wharton Business School and the University of California, Berkeley. He is author of more than 40 publications in international journals and, of course, books. And my question to you is, how can we leverage on space technology for risk finance?
Thank you, Donatella. Hope you can hear me well. It's a real pleasure to be with you. When I first received the invitation, I was wondering whether I would be the right speaker, since, as you said, I'm an economist. I'm not at all an expert on spatial finance. And then, on a personal note, I realized that, in fact, we've been doing at the bank, and I've been doing what I would call spatial finance for down-to-earth applications for more than 15 years. At that time in Mongolia, for example, we've been using some remote sensing technology to, I would say, evaluate vegetation indices to help herders in Mongolia deal with drought. More recently, we've been working in the Pacific, collecting through satellite images information of public assets and private assets to inform our clients in small island states for insurance solutions. So this is something which is new for me, but at the same time, it's something we've been using for some time on some applications. On a more serious note, let me also take this opportunity to flag that we've been working with the European Space Agency for some time. In fact, we do have since 2018 a partnership with ESA, and my colleague from the World Bank, Antoine Babendi, in fact, is based in Rome working with ESA, because we did realize that there is a tsunami of information coming, and it's important for us to be able to extract the right information to help our country clients, decision makers, to make right information, right decision when it comes particularly to deal with climate change and green finance. So in my presentation today, I will first maybe explain what the World Bank has been doing on climate change. Of course, it's a critical agenda, a front and center in our agenda, because it has major implications in terms of development objectives, including the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework for Action, and the Sustainable Eradication of Poverty. And the World Bank launched last month our new World Bank Agenda on Climate Change, the Climate Change Adaptation Plan for the World Bank. And under this new adaptation plan, the idea is really to try to support green, resilient, and inclusive development, increasing significantly the World Bank Group co-financing for climate from 25 to 35%, and focusing particularly on adaptation, and also providing the right diagnostic tools for our clients to make informed decisions, including with the development of the country climate and development reports. And of course, the objective is really to align, in fact, our financing with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Another agenda which is quite relevant for the World Bank right now is what we call IDA replenishment. As you may know, IDA is a large pot of money dedicated to low-income economies, and under this IDA 20 agenda, which will start next year, climate change is one of the special themes. So again, this is very much front and center on this agenda, and any information to help us, again, drive and inform decisions will also come from new technology like satellite images, not only from the green aspect but also for the resilient aspect. And again, I will elaborate a bit more, since this is my area of expertise. From the finance perspective now, let me also highlight why finance is not only important for green and resilient growth, but also how tools we're going to discuss today may also help us further improve this agenda. We do believe that financial sector is an important player in this kind of climate change agenda, not only for the long-term institutional investors in order to help rebalance and redistribute the climate-related risks and also maintain financial stability, but also in terms of new opportunities created by developing new hedging instruments, whether it is catastrophe bonds, whether it is index-based insurance that will ultimately help our clients, governments, firms, businesses, or even smallholders and households to manage those risks. And also it helps, I would say, reallocate efficiently green investments and focusing particularly on the green sectors. From an oversight perspective, we're also working closely with the central banks and other regulators in order to adapt the frameworks and practices to address the multiple risks faced by climate change. And again, access to the right information coming from satellite technology would also help inform the regulators and the supervisors. But most importantly, the financial sector can also contribute to the financial management of climate risk in the real sector, because the high quality of corporate disclosures, for example, will improve the understanding of risks and the ability to manage them by both disclosing for the companies as well as for the financial investors. So we need a strong and resilient financial system in order to improve and to drive, in fact, a greener and a more resilient economy. So from the bank perspective and from the finance unit perspective, this is on this slide how we frame, if you wish, our agenda from the disclosure and the reporting, as I just mentioned, and I'm sure that we're going to discuss that further with the TCFD colleagues, from the risk management perspective, as I discussed, and also from the green finance perspective. All of that being supported by analytical and advisory services, and also by global discussions, whether it's with the NGFS, the Network for Green in the Financial Sector, the G7 and the G20 agenda, or also the Insurance Resilience Global Partnership. And in all of these kind of discussions, the need to access the right information at the right time, including through satellite images, is front and center. It's critical, even more so in developing economies where sometimes data are not as developed as they could be in more developed economies. A few words maybe on disclosure and reporting, and again, I'm sure that my fellow panelists will touch upon that from other perspective. But from our perspective, what we're observing is incompleteness in terms of data coverage, a lack of standardization when it comes to collecting data, particularly for developing countries, and sometimes also limited investor awareness of those limitations for risks and opportunities. And in fact, I was just reading a recent article about the new rules established by the European Union that will oblige in the near future to report on sustainable data, and more than 50,000 firms will have to report on that. So this is just in Europe, but we will expect, of course, in the future, the same standards, the same requirements to apply in other economies. And we need, at least from the World Bank perspective, together with our IMF colleagues, we need to make sure that our clients are ready to some extent to collect this information to better inform their decision. And again, as I said, the TCFD is also a very important body also to promote this kind of transparency in the reporting. And again, we're working also closely with them. Let me also highlight on the work we've been doing on risk management, which is a second pillar on our, I would say, climate finance agenda. And here is a very good example of where a spatial technology, what you call finance, space for finance, can be quite relevant. I did mention in introduction on personal notes that this is something we've been using for some new products, some particularly parametric insurance products we've been developing, but this is something that now we need to mainstream even beyond, in fact, the development of insurance products. And in that specific context. On this slide, this is just an illustration of the work we in fact doing as we speak with the Central Bank of Morocco. Again, helping the Central Bank of Morocco to prepare climate physical risk assessments and in order to develop some forward-looking scenarios. And again, to be able for them to better manage the impact of climate change on their overall economy. And on this agenda, we're working on a three-step approach. One is to, first of all, do proper diagnostic on climate and financial risks. Sometimes it's a qualitative diagnostic, sometimes it's more quantitative. And again, this is where the spatial data can be extremely helpful, for example, to collect data on exposure, because in most of those countries, the exposure data are not available. The second step is about designing the right climate scenarios, and we can also work with the scenarios developed, for example, by the NGFS, and also try to plug some extreme event scenarios related to tropical cyclones or related to flood or even related to drought that will also make those scenarios more realistic. And again, access to spatial data is extremely important to make those scenarios realistic and also to be able to implement that not only in middle income countries like in the case of Morocco, but also in lower income countries like in Western Africa, where again we're working with the Western African central banks to develop those basic scenarios. One thing also I want maybe to highlight, and this maybe subject for further discussion, this is the diversity of the capacity and the clients we're dealing with, which may require some diverse solutions, including access to satellite data. Again, from our perspective, it's not the lack of data, which is challenging, but this is how to interpret, how to capture the data and to turn that into something that can be used for proper decision making by our respective counterparts. If I were to come up with some sort of a wish list on how to leverage Earth observation data, I'm again talking from a user perspective, not at all from an expert perspective. I would say, first and foremost, to be able to come up with some simple and pre-processed metrics. As I said, we're dealing with a diverse group of counterparts in developing economies, and we need to make sure that the level of information we provide does match their expectations and their needs. It has to be simple enough also to be replicated at a large scale, and sometimes in difficult environments. The second point is to, at the same time, to be able to come up with some granular metrics for some sort of bottom-up analysis, including on asset level. As I said, it's challenging in many countries to have a proper understanding of the financial exposure, and collecting those assets using satellite technology can be quite relevant and sometimes cheap, I would say, so we can replicate that. As I said, given the diversity of the countries we're dealing with, it's important that those metrics are tailored to the need of our respective countries. They have to be consistent, continuous in terms of the global coverage. They have to be transparent and objective and impartial in terms of bringing in evidence, and also building as much as possible with historical data, which also makes them more palatable sometimes when we deal with our with our client countries. And all of that will help us, better monitor the financial assets to be able to interpret those informations, and combining with the geolocated information, this will also help, again, make informed decisions, not only from the supervisor perspective, but also from investors. And again, it's quite important also as part of our green and resilient growth agenda that we can also, create the right environment to attract investors and also to incentivize them to invest in the right sectors, particularly if we want to align, as I said, our financing with the Paris Agreement. So if I were to summarize, and this is my last slide, again, going back to our very basic framework in terms of disclosure and reporting, very interested to hear more about how to come up with a subset of what we call essential climate variables that will inform our operations. Again, having a very down-to-earth approach using satellite images. In terms of risk management, very important also, particularly on the climate physical risk assessments, which sometimes is a bit missing compared to the more transition risk assessments. So from the climate physical risk assessment, being able again to better understand the financial exposure a country is facing, and to use the Earth observation-based risk mapping and modeling to support, in fact, those decisions, including using the artificial intelligence on new technology to process this massive amount of data. And as I said, from the green finance perspective, again, very important also to use this technology to better inform our decision makers, and ultimately to incentivize investors to invest in greener technology. So I will stop there. Again, this is from the bank perspective, from the World Bank perspective. This is something we're trying now to move to the next generation, and hopefully this workshop will also help us to better understand what's there in the international community, the university community, and also the commercial community, and making sure that we can make the best use of this information for the best interest of our clients. I will stop there and thank you for your attention. Back to you, Donatella.
Thank you very much, Olivier. And we will have a Q&A session at the end. Thank you very much for your intervention. Now I would like to introduce our second speaker, Paul Hibert. Paul heads the Systemic Risk and Financial Institution Division of the European Central Bank. In these roles, he leads a systemic risk analysis for the Euro area, feeding into the ECB flagship financial stability review, as well as a macroprudential policy for the largest Euro area banks. His current role builds on over 20 years of experience within the ECB, the International Monetary Fund, the Reserve Bank of Australia, and the Canadian Department of Finance in various capacities, spanning economics, financial, and policy functions for a wide range of countries. He has published on a diverse set of topics, including financial cycles, global banking, climate change, macroprudential policy, housing markets, and fiscal policy. He holds a Master of Art in Economics from the McGill University in Montreal. Paul, welcome. My question is, how do you translate physical and transition climate risk drivers into financial risk suitable for ongoing financial stability assessment?
Thank you, Donatella, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. I hope you can hear me fine.
Perfectly.
Great. So it's a word of intro, and thanks to Olivier for setting this scene. And indeed, if he was the right speaker, I had even stronger doubts initially. But I have to say, I came around having a look more closely at the links, and I see that they're actually potentially quite strong, and I'll come around to why. I can say as a matter of intro, of course, measuring and tackling climate risks, it's quite complex. It's going to involve many actors, there's multiple angles to consider, and it's certainly a collaborative effort, and I think we can learn a lot from each other, and I'm very happy to be here today with that in mind. Now, I'm in a central bank, and in a central bank, we're not obviously the key actors responsible for climate policy per se, enabling action. The most important tools are outside of our mandates. At the same time, I think it still doesn't mean we should ignore climate change, and even more so, I think we actually can play a role and do want to play a role in combating it. Keeping in mind, our role is mainly that of risk managers. And I want to focus on this risk angle today, and indeed take up that question you've asked me, Donatella, is that climate risk drivers is, of course, key. For us, it lies a little bit outside of laid a little bit outside of our comfort zone in the past. But moving that into the world of financial risk is actually more obvious than one might think, and I'm going to come around to how we do that. Now, we've had limited interaction with the ESA to date, and I think that's a pity, because looking at the potential for coincident interest, I think actually the potential is quite high. I would say three things are pretty important. I'll come back to them at the end. The first is we do need and rely on mapping to understand physical risk in particular. And I think the ESA has key data and key role to play here. The second is about tracking, so tracking evolution of environmental and climate metrics. And the third is about verification. Olivier made this point too, that markets do need reliable, objective, fact-check matter. And I'll come back on these points at the end. But in the meantime, I want to just share with you some of the work we're doing on financial risk measurement and assessment. in this idea indeed of translating climate risk in drivers into financial risk. And I hope that would better inform efforts on your side and those of the constituents in the call. So basically, my narrow role is leading a European Systemic Risk Board group. And we're trying to look at the financial stability risks from climate change, which are arguably quite strong, given the pervasiveness of climate change and indeed its inevitability, and to bring some more positive information to what is otherwise quite often a normative debate. So there are some novel data collections here, and I'm going to share some of those with you. What I can say maybe just to start is what have been the findings of our work so far. What we wanted to do when we established this work is to better understand what can we measure with existing data, existing models and finance, and trying to retrofit them so they're suitable for climate analyses. And it was not initially obvious, but I think we've made some good strides in the meantime. The 4 findings we had from a report published last June, you see the reference here below, were the following. I think it's important to recall these. First, that climate shocks are inevitable. So we'll either get physical risk manifestation as the world heats, and indeed that's not only in the risk profile, but it's in the baseline at the moment. At 1.5 degrees is pretty much baked in, and 2 degrees seems quite likely at this stage. So we're near these tipping points. But of course, transition risks too entail costs, short-term economic costs, and it's that trade-off which is important in understanding how we might have economic and financial impacts eventually. But I would say they're inevitable in some form, and hopefully in a less severe form. Second point was about financial market pricing. So whilst they're inevitable, financial markets do not seem to be pricing them in earnest in a meaningful way. But scale is building rapidly, and markets are plagued by imperfect, in our world of the economy, it's imperfect markets. They have insufficient information, they have inconsistent information, and there's very incomplete data. And that makes it very hard for financial markets to actually play the role they should, let alone the horizon questions, which are inherent to climate as a very long horizon issue, potentially, although I think not necessarily, because you could have near horizon changes. Third idea that we wanted to get into is if financial markets could reprice this quite violently in some scenarios, what would be the exposures of the financial sector? Again, keeping in mind our risk perspective and focus. And then fourth was to examine more trade-offs. And the trade-offs were insofar as transition versus physical risk. In our view, from what we've collected so far, the cost of political or economic inaction seem to be a lot higher than the cost of action per se. So with that in mind, we've been making strides in measurement, and we've been making strides in methodology. You see some of the things listed here. Obviously, trying to complete out data, which are quite novel for us to collect. More climate metrics, which were not normally resident in central banks and the financial community, but are becoming much more pervasive. And on the methodological side, it's really about horizon. Our risk horizon tends to be 2 to 5 years at most. And these are decade-long phenomena that we're looking at. So that's really a big challenge for us, and the channels which may be a bit novel. So with this in mind, let me give you a few, I think, bits of data which help to inform you what sorts of strides we're making in understanding this risk and measuring it out. So first on the physical risk side. So we've been working with data providers, private data providers, you see them in the source below. I'm looking at physical risk scores for around 2 million Euraria firms. And indeed, Olivier mentioned the need of granular information, and this, I think, illustrates that quite nicely. Each dot in this map of Europe corresponds to a firm in our sample, so it's address level. And we give the susceptibility or vulnerability to 4 different types of blocks of physical risk hazards. First is floods, dark blue. And you can imagine in Europe, that could be a big one with a lot of riverways in Europe. And this is where industry meets coastal areas or rivers. It's super important. It's probably one of the most important. Secondly is about sea level rise. It's the light blue, obviously near coasts. Third is wildfire, red, which is more in the southern part of Europe, obviously where you have higher temperatures are potentially more prevalent. And obviously the fourth is about other hazards, and that brings water stress, heat stress, hurricanes, typhoons. Less prevalent in Europe, of course, very important elsewhere. And that means that we can see a bit about where might the incidence of physical risk stress be. What we're doing in our work, I think our job as financial risk managers, is to understand the attributes of the entities which sit in these areas. Are they productive firms? Are they holiday houses? Where do they sit in a value chain? What is the link to the headquarters of the firm? Where does the ultimate risk lie? These are big questions for us. Secondly, of course, what are the mitigants? Olivier spoke about insurance. I think insurance can be a helpful mitigant, but of course, in the case of systemic risks, which is very pervasive, you might have an uninsurability issue, which means that gross exposures become quite relevant. It means you cannot smooth these out through time or across entities, which could be a big, big issue. So that's the physical risk side. I mentioned also transition risk is the other, of course. It's essentially here, I think the most important thing is greenhouse gas emissions, of course, and plans to reduce the latter. Again, here we've got granular data we've been collecting with the help of private data providers, around 5 million firms worldwide. And what we find, if you look here, is that European country codes here are listed on the vertical. And on the horizontal, we have the main industries, the industrial industries. What you see is that climate risks in the form of greenhouse gas emissions that are high tend to be resident in some specific industries like mining, like energy, like manufacturing, where you see these bits of darker color in terms of the columns. On the road side, you do see it's heterogeneous across countries, of course. So the susceptibility to climate risk is very much something which is country specific. And in a map I just showed you, potentially even very much region specific within countries. And I think one of the things we've noticed in our data collection so far is that the industrial classification of a given firm only imparts so much in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Some firms are very emissions intensive, and some are quite emissions efficient within industries, not just across. So the devil is really in the detail here. Now, what we've been trying to do, and I think the key thing for us is to be able to map this out into trade-offs of transition versus climate risk, not to look at them in isolation. And we have a stress test with this in mind that we're currently working on and hope to publish by mid-year some results. For the moment, there's a blog which is sourced below. I'm going to give you the main elements here. I think it helps to frame our thinking of how we translate climate risk drivers into financial risk, the question you'd asked me at the outset, Donatella. And that's about the idea of climate scenarios, of course, is inherent here. I think you've heard Olivier speak about the network for greening the financial system. It's around 80 plus central banks and supervisors around the world collaborating. And I think one of the main fruits of that collaboration has been a set of standardized scenarios, which helps us to have a systematic look at potential climate shocks. We take rich worldwide data. I've shown you already some of them in the form of the physical risks and transition risks, and we apply them to the widest swathe of banks as we can. We have, of course, the climate risk drivers, which is important as it is fundamentally the question of physical risk, transition risk, mitigants I've mentioned, insurance. Then we have obviously novel models which tackle potential linkages we're not accustomed to tackling, climate moving to financial, with the bank focus, one of our key focuses, but of course the non-bank financial intermediary sector is another. And then we want these feedback loops eventually. Of course, what happens in the economy in dual materiality means the financial sector is not insulated from obviously contributing to risk. With this in mind, we run these scenarios for the NGFS, which is quite standard by now. I basically go through them very quickly. There's a reference scenario, which is green. That's the idea we have limited transition or physical risks, so timely and effective implementation of climate policy. The two yellow ones here about disorderly, where you have more transition, potentially with more physical risk if they're done potentially poorly, or with less physical risk if they're effective. But either way, you have more transition risk. And the fourth block here is about physical risk, where it dominates, and it's this hothouse world scenario. Now, just to come around to the results before I close up, is the idea that when you run these scenarios through, preliminary findings suggest that early and orderly action to stem climate change could really help in terms of reducing firms' probabilities of default. And those default probabilities for us, of course, are rather important as they feed through into the financial system and create feedbacks from a systemic perspective. So the scenarios here in this chart, just to unpack it, you have the yellow, which is a limited physical risk, the orange, which is more physical risk, and the red, which is this idea that physical risk dominates hothouse world. And what you can see is for the median firm, which is the bars, obviously the sectoral allocation matters a lot when we aggregate up our data. Again, mining, transport, agriculture, electricity are very important. Mining perhaps most so. But what's quite interesting is if you look at the most vulnerable firms to physical risk, the diamonds. So we take within sectors, what are the most emissions intensive firms? We see they could be around 4 times higher in terms of their susceptibility to physical risk, suggesting again, you could have quite a calamity if action is not sufficient to stem temperature rises. Now, just before giving you back the floor, I wanted to just close up with the idea, what you can measure, you can manage, is the old adage. And our view is we want to be able to measure this well before we turn to evidence-based policies. And we are at the point now where I think we can start making that pivot. The 3 things which I mentioned at the outset, I just want to come back on in terms of where I think promising avenues are in terms of space technology and finance. And again, recalling these. First, mapping. This mapping assets of global companies through machine learning and remote sensing, I think, is a key one. And you're doing work in that sphere, which I think we're already using in some of the physical risk work we're doing. Second is, of course, tracking the evolution of climate environmental metrics. And obviously, this is important, not just climate, but also environmental deforestation, biodiversity questions, which may reverberate back in financial risk. And the third and last is verification. I think satellite technology obviously allows us to verify the accountability of companies. We're making a lot of forward-looking commitments now to Paris-aligned net zero, and large, frequent, and independent data can help us a lot. So with those 3 points in mind, I look forward to the remainder of the workshop and happy to field any questions in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this very interesting presentation. A lot of questions. We will concentrate all of them at the end of the discussion. Thank you again. And now I would like to introduce our third speaker, Claire Joly. Claire is the head of unit in the Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. Claire Joly has over 20 years of experience in business and policy analysis, supporting decision-making and strategic planning in public and private organizations in Europe and in North America. She joined the OECD in 2003. She has authored and contributed to over 50 publications, books, reports, articles, focusing on the evolution and economic impacts of science and technology-intensive sectors. Her background is in international economy, engineering with a special interest in space sector. She is also an alumna of the French Institute of Higher National Defense Studies in Paris and of the Singularity University in Santa Clara. My question to Claire is, OECD is currently supporting the G7 presidency held by the UK and the G20 held by Italy. What are the latest findings on the finance environment from green and digital point of view?
Thank you, Donatella, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate to this meeting. We have been working at the OECD with ESA for a number of years, and it's really, I would say, a very important commitment that we've seen here in the development of downstream applications. And we believe it's very important for the future of the space economy. So thank you again very much for this invitation. I will talk to you today indeed about the work that we're doing at the OECD on sustainable finance with the particular case of greening infrastructure. I will be the voice of my colleagues that are working hard right now to support in particular the G7 presidency of the United Kingdom. And I do believe indeed that focusing on the greening and digital transition in finance is really an interesting case for space. So in this presentation, I will share some perspectives from our work and particularly focus then here really on infrastructure, which I think is going to be a bit of a different angle from the two previous presentations we had on risk management. Trying to get to the next slide. There we go. Here we go. So in terms of vocabulary, you have here the definition of sustainable finance as expressed by the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group. It can be understood as the financing as well as related institutional and market arrangements that contribute to the achievements of strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth. This is of course really linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. I will focus on this in this presentation on 3 points. First, on some public policy goals and trends concerning sustainable finance. Second, the key issues of implementation of these objectives with the need for data collection, monitoring, evaluation, and obviously some implications for space. When talking about sustainable finance at the G20 or G7 levels, a key aspect is the need to focus on infrastructure. In OECD countries and beyond, the need for investments are very important not only because infrastructure are decaying over time, but also because they are impacted by climate change, with some roads, for instance, melting in the summer in Canada, the US, and parts of France. And of course, as we heard earlier in the previous presentations, there's a push to transition to a low carbon emissions economy. Most existing energy and transport infrastructure in particular were designed and built for a world of cheap and abundant fossil fuels, contributing to economic growth in many regions of the world, of course, but also obviously to carbon emissions. As a result, around 60% of emissions are really hardwired into existing infrastructure. The majority of the green investments are today required in transport and power, two critical sectors that are also at the heart of decarbonization strategies. As you can see here in this chart, the investments gaps are very large, with annual investments of around 4.4 trillion per year for G20 countries, where the needs are almost double that. Though these numbers here do not reflect yet the US and European plans for infrastructure investments. But still, the pathway for low emission, climate resilient infrastructure will require exceptional green transformation and investments. And public spending will not suffice to finance the green transformation. In fact, a significant amount of private investment is obviously required. It is therefore important to align the financial system, banking, capital markets, insurance with sustainable development. In order to do that, there are a number of policy initiatives at the international level to really build up the right incentives. I've included here a few. I mentioned already the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group. There is also the G7 and UNEP Financial Center for Sustainability, which is right now very active under UK presidency. At regional level, we have, of course, the European Green Deal and the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan. In 2016, the OECD took a major step to support all these objectives and initiatives by establishing a Center on Green Finance and Investment. The Center mission is to help catalyze and support the transition to a green, low emissions and climate resilient economy. It provides today a global platform for engaging with key players, including many private sector partners. But one key element with all these initiatives is the actual need for implementation. In terms of making sure all actors have the same vocabulary on what is meant by green investments, definitions, taxonomies, but also most importantly, on tracking and monitoring the efforts that public and private stakeholders engage in. When you have such a large scale and sustained investments representing millions, billions of dollars, you need some monitoring tools, and these are the environmental social governance, ESG criteria. These are a set of standards for companies' operations that socially conscious investors use to monitor the sustainability and societal impacts of their investments. When looking at the different families of environmental social governance criteria, there is a very strong demand for indicators at all levels, from public institutions and the corporate world. According to the latest report produced this year for G7 on sustainable finance, the market for ESG criteria tripled in just 5 years. But how do you capture well the impacts of sustainable finance? How are you sure that the work on buildings, on transport infrastructures, on ports are green enough? To make the right investment decisions, there are still many institutional and market barriers. These include, for example, the lack of information or even information asymmetry regarding the actual outcome of the current sustainable development, sustainable investments. As listed here in this slide, you can see issues in terms of accessibility, coverage, comparability of data on sustainable finance. They are still an issue, and of course, the user capabilities and skills to process and analyze this data. They represent also a challenge, very much so like the previous presenters talked about in terms of some of the risk management and finance risks. So what does it mean for space downstream services? You will see here for illustration a few of the major index providers that are building right now environmental social governance, again, famous ESG now, criteria. When you look at these criteria, particularly environmental ones, carbon emissions, renewable energy, it is clear there are opportunities to use satellite capacities to help monitor some of these criteria. Pollution, changes in land use and reforestation are a good example, particularly for large-scale infrastructures and even for some urban projects. As observations already contribute to monitoring. At the OECD, ourselves, we are users of satellite data. We are exploring and using satellite data for a number of our environmental indicators, such as air quality and land cover. But for ESG criteria that are guiding investment decisions, there are still some very strong technical challenges here that are listed. They're not new, but I do believe that's going to be very interesting in the next sessions to actually address some of these points. So to conclude here, my presentation really wanted to give you a flavor of some of the ongoing work at the OECD in different fora in terms of sustainable finance to green infrastructure. The needs are huge, and we see this growth in the need of indicators to actually support investors, both public and private investors. We do believe that space-based observations in particular have a role to play. Now, I would say the ball is in ESA camp to actually make sure that some of the solutions are here. Definitely, there's a very strong demand to actually get some good data to feed into the indicators that will help to transition to a greener infrastructure. So with this, I will stop here. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share some of the OECD findings.
Thank you very much, Claire, for this extensive presentation, for the challenge in front of us that we are, as you heard from our DG, very ready to take on us. So we're looking forward to continue our excellent cooperation with the OECD. And now I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Marianne Haar. Marianne is the Executive Director of the Green Digital Finance Alliance, a non-profit foundation co-founded by UNEP and the Ant Group with a mission to scale green finance with fintech. Marianne also serves on the technical expert group of the PNFE. Prior to that, Marianne was advisor to the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Denmark on digital finance in emerging markets. She has also been leading the think tank Sustainia, working of technology for green finance, and she started her professional career building microfinance solution for climate mitigation and adaptation in West and Southern Africa. Marianne holds a Master of Science from the University of Copenhagen. My question to Marianne is, first of all, thank you for being with us. Marianne, what are the current trends of green digital finance? Which transition instruments are resulting the most promising?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for having us, and to the esteemed speakers before me who laid out really important points. Exactly, I will look at green finance shaped by regulation and accelerating technology, and I will take you through 3 trends today where regulation and technology work together. It is the first is voluntary to mandatory disclosure on climate. The second is from climate only to climate plus biodiversity risks. And the third is from pure play instruments to transition finance. I will not dive deeply into the regulations, but I will focus on how technology, including spatial data, is currently leveraged and how it could be leveraged even further to scale green finance. Geographically, I will focus on the European Union as a leader in regulation, and then I will also focus on Asia as one of the regions that is also leading, at least at the G20, work on sustainable finance, and where transition is also highly needed. So if we look at the first trend, then in the EU, shifts are really driven through regulation at the regional level, including the introduction of the taxonomy regulation, but also of the recently launch of the SFDR regulation. And as part of these shifts, harmonization will really need to arrive for us to deploy properly technology to implement these new regulations in the financial community. And this standardization, we hope, will come through the upcoming work of the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation work to standardize sustainability reporting, as well as with the TCFD and the upcoming TNFD to be launched very soon. Because standardization is really needed for us to leverage spatial data and for us to leverage digital technologies more broadly. One example of a front-runner regulator actually applying technology to monitor TCFD I have displayed on the slide, and it's the Central Bank of Spain. So what the Central Bank of Spain has done is that they have created an algorithm where they use natural language processing to estimate the TCFD compliance among Spanish financial service institutions along the three parts of the TCFD pillar framework that you see on the slide. So it's metrics and targets, risk management, strategy, and governance. The index gives an overview of the evolution of the level of climate-related financial disclosures present in the corporate reports of the Spanish banking sector. The results indicate that the quantity of climate-related disclosure reporting by the banking sector is growing each year. And it has been applying the algorithm for a period from 2014 to 2019. This is not leveraging spatial data or verifying by spatial data, but that could be the next step to overlay this information with spatial data if they had the geolocation data of these assets. So the same types of algorithms could also be used by central banks as the TNFD come online. The other jurisdiction here that you see on the slide where regulators are actually deploying technology to monitor green finance or climate finance in their market is in Asia, and it's China. It's where you see they introduced last year a disclosure requirement on ESG risks of all A-listed companies. And what you see on this slide is a cloud-based platform that the People's Bank of China is currently leveraging as a green financial information management system. Among other things, it connects with the financial service institutions to collect green lending statistics and ensure regulation of green lending processes by using big data, AI, cloud computing, and other technologies. The system makes data traceable, comparable, and measurable, and addresses common challenges like poor data quality and lack of real-time reporting. But we are not seeing that many regulators having adopted these types of approaches yet. But looking to then, what are the responses in the real economy to increasing climate disclosure regulation? Then let's turn to China again. It's a country with very low levels of disclosure, but it's also one of the countries using most actively Earth observation technology to harvest data on emissions at facility level. The data challenge in China currently is that Earth observation data really to enter financial decision making, it's mainly a question of data not being presented in an investor-ready format. And I think that's what we see in most jurisdictions. We see solutions emerging, such as what you see on the slide, which is the Blue Map app, which takes corporate disclosure data, official records of environmental fines, and overlays it with censored data from corporate value chains. This is air quality data according to geolocation, water quality data, soil quality data, and additional data points, and turns that into an environmental credit score for companies. And it currently has 6 million companies, and it harvests automatically 2 million emission data sets daily. What it doesn't have, and what could really bring value to the asset manager community wanting to invest into China, is that, and where spatial data could be highly leveraged, is that it doesn't have the value chains going into these facilities, so being imported into China, to make the environmental credit score not only scope 1, but also scope 2 and 3 of the operations. This would make it even much better, and a really good use case for spatial data. Then again, looking at China in 2017, the country adopted 7 green finance pilot zones. So that is something other countries could also look at, because that has spurred quite a lot of innovation in the application of green digital finance. Here's the example of the Houston Bank that is testing a cloud-based platform extracting from transaction data whether a transaction lives up to green criteria. And the idea is to increasingly move to automated green labeling of assets, which could also be verified using spatial data, but is currently not being. But a use case for spatial data that is on the market currently in China is that because of the low degree of company disclosed data and the data quality issue, WeBank has bought a fleet of satellites where it's deploying AI to the images to develop indices and other investment tools related to environmental risks of Chinese companies. And target customers are both international asset managers, but it's also local banks building wealth management teams because of the high net worth individual segment growing very fast in the country. And also because of the fact that the market is opening up to foreign capital. Now let's look at the second trend, which is around climate only to climate plus biodiversity. Here we see a lot of movement going on in the regulatory space. So first it was the Central Bank of the Netherlands that issued the Indebted to Nature, where they tried to look at how big a percentage of the Netherlands financial system is dependent on nature and therefore subject to physical risks. And they found that it was 36% of the financial system. And they also tried to look into which are most exposed to transition risks of their parts of financial system. We've seen that being replicated by Banque de France. And now we've just seen that NGFS is starting also a study to look together on exactly what are the financial stability risks and the transmission pathways of biodiversity loss to the financial system. So we serve on the expert group to the TNFD, scoping the TNFD on the data side, and that will of course be launched very soon, and will of course come with a framework both in having a phased approach, just like the TCFD to data, but also having a double materiality, as we also heard Paul talk about in the TCFD. So both looking at how what are the impacts of a financial service institution's operation on nature and biodiversity, and what are the material financial risks of biodiversity loss to the institution. And really where it's most progressing, of course, is in France, when the new disclosure regulation now puts an obligation of French asset managers and asset owners to illustrate not only climate risks, but also biodiversity and nature risks across their portfolio. And that, of course, lends itself to increasingly a spatial data use case. So what is really some of the market response to biodiversity and nature increasingly becoming also seen as a material risk to financial service institutions? What we currently see in the market response is that there are 6 tools out in the market that offers portfolio analysis of material biodiversity risks to asset managers and asset owners' portfolios. I have just taken a few of them on this slide. I think a general trend in these tools is that the data layer of these models are mainly databases such as the Xio base, which is basically life cycle assessment databases, Globio and EcoInvent. And what they are doing is that they're using environmental pressure specific commodity trade flow data, and they link to trade flow data, they link environmental pressures. So basically they use macro and sector averages. So it does not give you, it is not deploying technology really to upload data from the real economy, but it's using trade flow data. And it's also not giving you geolocation specific only at the country level, your exposure to biodiversity and nature risks. And really the data layer missing for these metrics to be much more specific on the assets, the risks in your portfolio is really, as we heard also from Paul, from the geolocation of asset data. As long as we don't have the disclosure of the geolocation of assets, of corporate activities, we cannot move away from sector averages, and we cannot move away from using macroeconomic data to get the nature risk disclosure, and we cannot overlay it properly with spatial data. So really what we need to see in disclosure regulation is that we need to see an explicit requirement to disclose the geolocation of your assets, and we need a standardized classification or typology of geolocation. Currently, what it looks like in disclosure reports is that geolocation is interpreted in many different ways. Sometimes it's country level, sometimes it's longitude latitude, which is the most useful. Sometimes it's a region, sometimes it's not comparable regions. So that is what we need to move to if we are to really properly leverage spatial data for nature risk disclosure and proper nature risk assessment for financial service institutions. And the last trend I will just touch upon is really around transition instruments. As we have seen in the climate space, we are progressively moving from pure play instruments, so green bonds and green equity, into transition instruments, because most of the economies and most of the asset classes are in a situation where they need to transition, and they need to be incentivized through interest rate rebates or other types of incentives to actually shift their behaviors. I've just taken the examples of two asset classes on the slide with high carbon intensity, and it's agriculture and real estate. Here, transition instruments such as energy efficient mortgages and biodiversity linked loans for farming are introduced mainly in the European Union, but for real estate also beyond, and leveraging technology. For real estate, a small group of FIs are actually looking into leveraging satellite data on their real estate portfolios to understand energy leakage hotspots. But most are using algorithms instead, estimating energy leakage and energy labels based on key characteristics of the building categories, such as years of construction, rather than Earth observation data. In agriculture, satellites are leveraged mainly for insurance pricing, credit in deforestation exposed regions, and also for soil mappings. Some are leveraging satellite data for developing historical profiles of farmer clients in countries where historical agricultural performance data is not available. This is to create scenarios of return on investment, data which can be used to design transition instruments. And that is what we are seeing, for instance, in the Netherlands, where Rabobank just issued this year a biodiversity-linked loan to the market. So I will end up here by seeing that these are some of the trends that we are seeing. But really, as I said before, I would just echo what we've heard Paul said, that we need much more specific asset geolocation data, and we need the regulators to really push on this for us to properly deploy spatial data to move this agenda forward. I want to thank you and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for this very, very interesting presentation and for the key takeaway to take with us. And I now would like to introduce our next speaker, who is David Carlin. David leads the TCFD program for the UNEP Finance Initiative. He most recently managed a banking pilot with over 3 dozen global financial institutions on topics of climate scenarios, climate risk assessment, and climate governance. He's also contributed to Forbes, where he writes about climate change and leadership. Prior to joining the UNEP FI, he worked as a senior manager in risk and public policy for Oliver Wyman Consulting and in model risk management for PNC Bank. His background is in quantitative modeling and decision science. He conducted research in financial decision-making at Carnegie Mellon University and graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Williams College. Welcome, David. My question for you is, how climate risk impact a financial institution? Is there a methodology to integrate climate science with a credit risk?
Great. Thank you so much, Donatella. It's really nice to be here. And I'm going to just share a few pages to talk through some of the ways that we've previously thought in our programs about bringing climate science together with financial impacts. And given that we are here for this this discussion with the European Space Agency, I'm also keen to talk a little bit about some of the areas where some of that data can play important roles in further enhancing the work and assessments that are done. So just to begin, I'll start with this recognition that I think all of us share from Mark Carney, that this view of climate is not about a particular sector or about a particular activity, but really an economy-wide impact. And it's imperative not only in order to manage climate risks effectively, but also to seize the opportunities and thrive in a changing world, one that is increasingly affected by climate, but also one that is increasingly aligning toward net zero and moving at a pace of transition, which is increasingly rapid. And so for firms to thrive, it's imperative to understand the types of climate risks they face and how they'll best deal with those. So it takes very little imagination to understand how certain types of climate risks may impact businesses. Certainly we think about strong storms affecting a particular asset, damaging that through flooding or through wind. We, of course, saw last year the destruction in Australia from wildfires. We certainly have seen on the transition side the continuing shrinking of many of the traditional energy companies, some of what the so-called oil supermajors, in terms of their returns, their market share. And so recognizing that both on the physical and transition side, there are some relatively straightforward impacts on given companies. I think it's often important to think about from a financial institution's perspective that if these are your clients or these are the firms that you've invested in, the climate impacts affect your balance sheet and affect your profitability in a few important ways. One way is through the macroeconomic changes. So as climate, if it induces changes in economic activity or increases in carbon prices, have implications for your portfolio companies or your borrowers. Those macro effects are certainly one of the transmission mechanisms. Another one on the more micro side is at the individual business level. How is that business able to compete, or how is that business able to be impacted by climate events, whether in terms of the physical damages or the transition to net zero? And so both at the micro and macro scale, we see finance being intimately linked and intimately related to the climate risks that we see all around us. So over the past 4 years since the TCFD recommendations were issued, we've run a number of programs here at the UN Environment Programs Finance Initiative, UNEP-FI, for institutions to participate in this. In our latest completed pilot, we had 39 global banks, about half of them from Europe, others with European operations, but based around the world. And with this group, we had a really diverse perspective, not only on the risks they face, but also on the ways to move forward and manage those risks. And so just a little bit about each of these programs to kind of go quickly through it. Our first program really focused on developing approaches. And the goal here, as Donatella had asked me, the goal here really was to think about how you take the science itself and the climate scenarios that have been developed, how you take those and then effectively bring them to bear on financial information. So in some ways, this was a translation exercise on both the physical and transition sides, taking first the climate scenarios, so things like the overall emissions, overall economic activities from various integrated assessment models on the transition side. On the physical side, looking at various extreme events, changes in their likelihood. And then the key here was a translation exercise to say, okay, under these changes, how do we see financial metrics themselves changing? And from there, so thinking about how do revenues decrease when there are more droughts on the physical side? How do costs increase when there's a carbon tax on the transition side? Okay, once we can think about that at a sectoral level or an industry level, then can we look at the borrowers that we have in our own portfolio and then make a suggestion about how we go forward and how we more effectively can manage the risks that they may be experiencing. As an example of this, to show what this path looks like on the transition side, you have the transition scenarios. These are what I was mentioning, integrated assessment models from places like the Potsdam Institute, from other leading climate researchers. And these are going to produce your key output quantities of what does the path look like to a 1.5 degree world, to a 2 degree world, to a greater than 2 degree world under these different scenarios. And then what we did was we created a translation exercise by looking at, for different sectors, what are the variables that are most likely to affect them financially? And we thought about this in terms of revenues and costs. So the idea here was to say, okay, if you have changes in these variables over the scenario, how is that going to drive up revenues? How is that going to increase costs, decrease costs? And then from there to say, can we select a series of representative borrowers and think about using the ratings that they've been assigned, how those ratings may change. So if we go back to the ratings criteria, we ask a series, or financial institutions typically ask a series of questions about what the particular borrower's financial position is. Now, can we sort of re-rate, pretend instead of looking at 2030, we're re-rating this borrower with the 2030 information today? What rating would that borrower take on then? So essentially the idea is a translation exercise from climate scenario to financially relevant information for different industries and sectors, and then looking at specific cases to see where idiosyncrasies may result in either stronger or weaker responses to these factors. So that's on the transition side, how we thought about it. Likewise, on the physical side, as I mentioned, again, the key to this is really the idea of a translation exercise. So we'll use agriculture as the example here. We have a number of data sources, publicly available ones, that are aiming to provide, under different temperature regimes, what changes are likely to happen in terms of agricultural productivity, in terms of frequency of droughts, in terms of changes in precipitation, as well as in the likelihood and frequency of extreme events. And so taking all those pieces together, what we did was we said, okay, if this is the current state of the world, how would more frequent storms, how would less frequent rainfall, how would changes in these physical environments be related to overall productivity? And so we looked at a series of correlations between, say, past extreme events as well as past changes in baselines to come up with those relationships. And then from there, from those questions of productivity, very similar to what I mentioned for the transition side, we said, okay, how can productivity and revenues then be related to the specifics of what the overall health of a given borrower is? So if revenues are going to decrease, all else equal, that borrower is going to see relatively weaker performance. If we take the stronger performance of being able to, say, sell more crops because the growing season lengthens, okay, how is that going to make the borrower's financial position stronger? So again, a key here is really this translation exercise. And then over the past couple programs, what we've really worked on is exploring a wider range of scenarios for institutions to understand. Also looking at different data sources and additional methodologies for assessment, and then thinking about the reporting and governance that is really critical here. And so in particular, the idea is that we wanted to help institutions not only understand the climate scenarios they face, but also more effectively measure and manage the climate risks. So we've talked about methodologies for assessment, but also some of the work that we've done and in some of the reports we've released really aims to provide guidance and perspectives for institutions who are looking to better manage those risks. And so a few of the outputs we put together were on climate scenarios and transition risk, as well as physical risk in terms of a blueprint for assessment. We developed a transition risk web tool also for doing assessments, and then a good practice guide for the TCFD disclosures themselves. And I think increasingly, one of the things I would say, as I'll just go back to just to the video, is I would say one of the big things that's particularly important and thinking about the work of ESA and others is it's really imperative that in looking at these scenarios, you have good data and you have clear data, not only at the macro level, as most of the work that I've been talking about is focused on, but also at that micro level, so at the asset level. So as Marianne was saying before, it's really critical to recognize how different assets are likely to be affected and currently are affected. And so on the physical side, this means mapping where hazards are likely to emerge, and the work of remote sensing is, I think, a critical one for that. But I think recently in the news, we've seen a lot about the importance of methane. And I think one of the critical ways of assessing that, especially assessing the viability of a company's transition plans, as well as the viability of your own climate goals, is to understand what kind of compliance they have and what sort of potential risks there are on the transition side. And so methane, I think, is one of the key ones where you have a need for continued assessment and continued recognition that how we have views about the economics. I think it's a great example in the sense that people have said previously that natural gas is a bridge fuel. It uses less than half the emissions of coal to produce its power. And however, the more we've learned over the last 2-3 years about methane leakages, largely thanks to satellite data and thanks to information that's provided aerially, the more that contention has come into question. And if you're a financial institution trying to make decisions about what pathway you want to follow to net zero, as well as what climate risks you're likely to face, these are critical questions to be able to rightly answer. And so having both the big picture at that macro level, as well as the smaller and more specific asset level information is going to be really key, whether you're setting targets for yourself around net zero, or whether you're trying to get a full accounting of your own risk. So I'll stop there. Obviously very glad to answer questions or hand it back to you, Donatella, for the next presenter. But great to be here. I think it's a fascinating forum, and I think the work that's being done will continue to be integrated into the financial sector.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for your very extensive presentation, and looking forward to the question and answer session. And now I introduce our last speaker for the first panel, who is Grégoire Chaudière-Ledrian. Grégoire is currently head of AB Group office in France. After 10 years dedicated to the European institution as head of offices of a French vice president. He has a strong academic background, École Normale Supérieure Institut d'études politiques, école d'études et sciences sociales. He has different professional experiences focused on public financial sector, French Treasury, French Agency for Development, expertise France, and Vietnam. Grégoire was also advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Laurent Fabius, in charge of economic and development matters to prepare the COP21. He had the opportunity to travel a lot, over 75 countries. He likes sport, particularly natural experience. He's married and father of 2 children. My question to Grégoire is the following. During this session, we had a chance to hear in different moments of climate-related investments and their sustainability. How does the EU's climate bank deal with the challenges of climate change on a strategic and practical level? And finally, how could space support? Thank you, Grégoire.
Thank you, Donatella, and I hope you can hear me, and you can also see the screen I've just shared with you, and thanks for all the whole introduction. I'm very pleased to be there, and pleased as well to conclude this first panel and to explain what EIB is doing to support the financing of the transition and the fight against the climate change. It's not a surprise, it has been fully described, but definitely next decade is potentially the critical decade. And Joe Biden, I'm pleased that Joe Biden has the same approaches and the same overview, and it's important to have also US to be supporting this. It will be the critical decade for climate and environment. We must definitely reduce emissions by 50% during this decade in order to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and by the end of the century. We must also combat environmental degradation, but also the catastrophic biodiversity loss. To achieve this, definitely significant investment, and we are dealing with trillions of euro or dollars up to you, is required in projects that contribute to climate action and environmental sustainability rather than in those we have negative impacts. And to do so, definitely public resources won't be enough, and we need to mobilize all the actors, private and public, to achieve such a need in terms of amount of and magnitude of trillions that are required. And this managed transition to a new green economy must be conducted in a socially inclusive manner, creating opportunities and offering support to ensure that no one is left behind. The European Investment Bank, this is the EU bank. This is one of the objectives is climate, its objective today is ambition is to become the EU climate bank. But we can say, in fact, it has been for a long time. Sustainability has always been in the activity of the EIB through the integration of environmental, climate, and social considerations in all the operations that we are supporting. We always are assessing the impact in terms of environmental, climate, and social externalities in all projects we are financing. We also issued the first world first green bonds in 2007, and I've pioneered sustainable development bonds focused on waters and other sectors such as health and education. And today, more than 10 years after, the green bonds market is mature, and we are pleased with World Bank to have been one of the first issuer of this kind of bonds. We first set climate action finance target back in 2010, and in 10 years that have passed since, our ambition has only been increasing in the climate action. We developed and improved a climate strategy. You mentioned it during the run-up of the 2015 climate conference in Paris, COP21. And during this conference, alongside with other multilateral development banks, we raised our commitments. During the COP21, the EIB committed to finance $20 billion a year globally for the next 5 years, and it means a total of 100 billion to the end of 2020, which was equal to 25% of our activity each year. 5 years later, we are pleased to announce that we reached our commitments, but definitively we consider that is not enough and we have to do more. And just for example, in 2019, we invested about 20 billion in climate action and environmental sustainability, and this is about 34% of our activity. But we consider that we should do more to reach our objective in terms of decarbonization of all the EU economies. Thanks to our engineers, we have a track record in identifying and supporting new and emerging technologies, including offshore wind, solar power, and more recently, floating wind turbines and energy storage solutions. But we fully consider that we need to support all kinds of innovation to achieve this ambition, and we need to invest in innovation. We are not promoting degrowth or stopping any production. We are investing in solutions to find new ways to consume and to produce. In 2019, the European Council and the EU member states, following the election of the European Parliament, where we had a very consciousness of the environmental aspect of our future in Europe. We decided with the EIB to strengthen our role and to become the EU Climate Bank by supporting the European Green Deal of the Commission and accelerating the transition to a carbon neutral and climate resilient economy by 2050. The climate, sorry, I'm delayed for my presentation. The Climate Bank Roadmap is a new 5-year plan for the EIB Group. It will ensure that we support a green recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, that we fully back the European Green Deal, including its just transition that has been mentioned today, and that we keep supporting countries in need outside the EU. And we make sure that our work contributes to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. A significant part of the first step of the climate roadmap has been dedicated to develop definition criteria and to ensure that the alignment with the Paris Agreement and the EU taxonomy for sustainable investment. Under Paris alignment, we understand that finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development. Investments will require an adequate justification showing that they are consistent with such a pathway. Within the EU, this implies consistency with net zero emission by 2050. We have also contributed to the landmark EU taxonomy for sustainable finance by establishing a clear, robust definition of what is green investment and to avoid any green washing. By doing so, we are now in a capacity within the EU to have a common language of what is green and what is not green, and to avoid any greenwashing, as I mentioned it. We face some doubt that have been expressed as to whether the COVID-19 and climate crisis can be addressed simultaneously. We are confident that it's not only possible, but also necessary. The COVID-19 recovery must be linked to a green transition, and a return to a business as usual take us to 3 degrees warning. So it is important to consider this recovery plan as actually an opportunity to speed up and to accelerate our transition. So just to highlight our climate bank roadmap, I would like to mention, and this is also important to highlight, that it has been approved by the 27 member states unanimously at the first discussion last year. And the main, sorry to come back, the main point of this is first to exclude, sorry, my presentation is not, to exclude from our investments all projects that are using fossil fuel. This is the first point of the climate roadmap. To raise our annual financing for climate action and environmental sustainability to more than 50% of our business by 2025. And to support €1 trillion of climate action and environmental sustainability over this critical decade, 2021 and 2030. And the last point of our ambition is to define how the EIB Group will align all its activity with the goals and principles of the Paris Agreement and apply a revised shadow carbon pricing policy. And EIB, and I'm proud to say so, but I would like to be followed by other institutions, and we know that we will be joined by others. EIB has been the first multilateral development bank to be Paris aligned by 2020, because we commit ourselves to be fully aligned at the 1st of January of 2021. So by doing so, our ambition is to align all new operations with this goal of 1.5 degree increased temperature. And we will definitively invest in all innovative technologies that are able to reduce emission and to promote digitalization. We will promote climate resilience in everything we do, so that investments, economies and communities are prepared for the impact of climate change that is happening right now, as well as those still to come. And we will definitively address the dual emergency of climate change, environmental degradation, and try to leave no one behind in this transition. And to this end, we will delivering in our green finance target. This climate bank roadmap will identify and prioritize synergy among climate action finance, environmental sustainability, and social development. And to do so, we will definitely also manage to assess and to report on climate risk in all our systems and maintain leadership in the development of green financial products and capital markets. This is our ambition, and we have started this transition now for the last few months, and definitively we will move on this transition within the next few years. But we rely on all the institutions in Europe to achieve this ambition at national level, regional level, but also with all the citizens to achieve this objective, this ambition, and this objective for the climate change. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Grégoire, for this ambition plan and for your interesting presentation. Now we have very few minutes for a session of question and answer. I know that Sasha and Thomas have been collecting a few questions from our audience. I can hand over to them to ask. I think we have time for a couple of quick questions. So please.
So first of all, thank you very much for all these great contributions today. We have received a couple of questions actually on how institutions deal with the data challenge. So we heard about the need for data collection, processing, analytics, from climate risk to environmental asset level data. So what is the consequence for the internal capacities? Are they going to be built up? Would there be more reliance on third-party data providers or eventually new partnerships? So what's your view on this?
I can go first. So, yeah, so I think it depends on the segment of financial services institution that you are. So if you are a smaller to medium-sized asset manager, then you usually have internal risk models where you will seek to integrate these types of nature and climate data into your risk and valuation models. Whereas if you're the really large financial service institutions, then you will have your Bloomberg terminals, etc., right? And will expect these types of data to hopefully come from fewer data providers. I mean, definitely the trend at the moment is a fragmentation that you, because of also nature requirements and biodiversity requirements coming along. So you as an FI have to handle quite a large number of data providers, which seems less sustainable in the long run because your transaction costs on data are significantly increasing. So it really depends on who you are, and sort of the data challenge currently is because of exactly lack of geolocation data that you're looking at the most exposed sectors and that you're looking mainly at your scope 1 activity, at least for the nature side. I'll stop here.
Can I step in?
Yes, please.
So very much agree with what just said. I would also highlight the I would say the timing dimension and the process to collect data. As I said, in countries where the World Bank is active, sometimes you simply start with a lack of data, and you cannot wait until you have the perfect set of data to provide proper, I would say, advice for decision making. So, of course, we all are aiming for the perfect set of data, micro data. But the question also, at least in our case, is what are the kind of intermediate steps to build this data on a kind of continuous basis to some extent to still provide information, in the short term, not waiting for the perfect set of data. Hence, the discussion and interesting conversation we're sometimes having between the qualitative data and quantitative data, and sometimes basic data are enough to engage a proper conversation and then leading to more sophisticated data. So the timing dimension and the process of collecting data and processing data, I think, is as important as the ultimate objective, having the perfect set of data.
Thank you very much, Olivier.
Yeah, maybe just really quickly, Sasha, I very much agree with Olivier on that. We absolutely can't wait until we have all of the data, and part of effective risk management is operating under uncertainty. I think that's a critical thing that I always come back to, which is with climate, we have a lot of uncertainties about locations of events, about pace of change, and that's not just on the physical system, but on the decisions toward decarbonization. And so I think it's important to think about both what processes, and these things have to happen in parallel, what processes we put in place, especially in countries where good data doesn't exist, but also at the same time, how do we take decisions with the data we have? And in some cases, that's thinking more macroeconomically in a top-down way in terms of what strategic actions we want to follow, while at the same time reinforcing and building these things. Because if there's one thing we know from working in the financial sector, it's that good data takes time to build up. It's not only getting the right questions, but building up that data over time once the processes are in place. So I think that those are the things that I would say that we need to act now, and we need to be good risk managers, recognizing that there is uncertainty and finding the areas and potential synergies. I think what's great about the set of speakers that you've brought today is there's such a diversity of knowledge and experience, and it's the need to collaborate across many of our groups to get some of these missing pieces. And even all together, we're not going to have all of the pieces, but they may help us to take the decisions. And I think that's the key, is really going from identification and even assessment to action. And that's what happens when you when you collaborate and when you find ways to manage the risk, even as you're building out better data going forward.
Thank you, David.
I could just jump in on the ECB side. I can echo very much, I think, what Olivier and David said. The perfect should not be the enemy of the good. We have a transition issue we're in at the moment, of course, where data that are available tend to be, as I mentioned, insufficient, incomplete, and at times not very comparable. But that doesn't mean, of course, we cannot supplement in the transition with additional third-party sources or best practices leveraging as we learn along the way. Of course, what we do want to keep our eyes on is in the steady state to make sure that we complete missing gaps. I'd say the two biggest ones, just to leave you with this on our side, so far what we've noticed is, of course, the geolocation of assets by productive use is raised by many speakers on the physical risk side. And on the transition risk side, it's Scope 3 emissions tend to be very much underreported, and where they are reported, we are concerned about. Perhaps I think the biggest mounting challenge at the moment is forward-looking commitments. We really do need a means of assessing these as they're becoming far more common. And I think that will, in many ways, in the financial sphere at least, determine the prospective potential repricing. So they do need to be for risk discovery, for financial markets to work well, in playing the allocator function which is needed to meet the challenge. We need to ensure that these are somehow validated and assessed in a consistent and appropriate way.
Thank you very much, Paul. So if there are no more comments with regard to this question, I hand back to Donatella.
Thank you, Sasha. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for further questions, but we will relay the question to our speaker for following up.